Please join with me in welcoming Professor Robert DeCaroli.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Paul. And I'd like to thank Irene Lin for inviting me and for everyone here at the Host Center for Buddhist Studies at Stanford. It was not an exhausting afternoon. It's been an exhilarating afternoon. I've enjoyed all of my conversations with the graduate students. It's a real joy to be able to talk with people who are interested in the same sort of strange things that I'm interested in. So that's been a real pleasure. So for some of you who were at the IABS in Toronto, you saw an early version of this paper. This is a more developed and lengthy version of that same topic. It was going to come out as an article in the Archives of Asian Art under the title Snakes and Gutters. So that will be the title of this one. I was trying to pun off snakes on a plane. I don't think I quite pulled it off, but anyway, there's always room for improvement. If I read from here, can you still hear me? Okay, it's just easier for me to maneuver with all of these things from over here. Okay, so in 1868, as part of the Meiji-era reforms aimed at dividing Shinto practices from those of Buddhism, the Japanese government legally separated a cave shrine housing a dragon king from the nearby monastery, Buddhist monastery at Muroji. The 19th century officials apparently did not recognize the cave shrine as being intrinsically linked to the monastery or to its practices. There are, however, clear records of the Buddhist monastic community of Muroji performing yearly rainmaking rituals to the Dragon King as early as the 8th century and continuing to do so into the 17th. Despite this historical information, it's not difficult to sympathize with the position taken by the Meiji officials, because even those familiar with the history of Buddhism do not often associate it with weather control. The fact remains, however, that for many centuries, such practices were both highly visible and widely spread across the Buddhist world. Ritual texts which elucidate the details of monastic weather regulation are among the least studied bodies of Buddhist literature. By the 5th century, the South Asian Buddhist community had already developed several rites or varshapanavidi, or rainmaking rituals, instructing specialists on how to go about regulating the weather. For example, in the Vajratunda Samayakalpa Raja, which has been discussed recently by Gerglihidas, it promises to create favorable weather to those who follow its guidance. The text dates to the Gupta dynasty, placing it somewhere between the 4th and 6th centuries. Divided into 6 chapters, it includes several narrative testimonials to the ritual's effectiveness and a variety of dharani, or short magical formulas, as well as descriptions of the ritual benefits and a long set of instructions on how to perform the actual ritual. These rituals employ a variety of techniques, including mandalas or sacred diagrams, kilas, nails or stakes, kunda, water pots, bali offerings, which are food offerings intended to appease, stamba, flagpoles, and pratima, images. A similar set of materials can be found in the Mahamegha Sutra, which was translated into Chinese in the 9th century, but likely originated in South Asia during the 5th. In it, the reader is promised a variety of benefits, some of which are derived from brief dharanis, and others involving complex ceremonies intended to either end drought or deluge. Another point of commonality uniting all these works is that neither claims to be effective through the direct power of the ritualist. Rather, the weather is altered indirectly by Nāgas, known as dragons in the East Asian sources, these serpent-like deities associated with water who act as the intermediaries for the ritual expert. To give a small example from the Vajratunda Samayakalpa Raja, part of the ritual requires the Vidyadhara, or the ritualist, or the sorcerer, to create the images of 4 Nāgas out of brown dung, and then to ritually pierce them with the kila, or nail. All these sorts of efforts are designed to compel the Nāga, whom in this case should be named and specific to the ritualist's region, to alleviate the problems caused by the weather. These rituals utilize a variety of techniques to convince the Nāgas to alter the local weather patterns. Often, the harsh weather conditions, such as the drought or the flood, that justify the need for the ritual are assumed to have been caused by either the negligence or the maliciousness of these Ophidian deities. The component actions of the ritual are therefore primarily designed to convince the Nāga to help. And they go about this persuasion in a variety of ways. Primarily, they appeal to the Naga's sense of Buddhist morality and compassion by asking him to take pity on those who are suffering. At other moments, they point out the karmic benefits of kindness or ask the Nagas to recall ancient oaths. And in some instances, they can be more coercive, resorting to threats if the ritualist's goals are not met. For example, the title of the Vajratunda Samaya Kalparaja is in fact a veiled threat. It references the adamantine or diamond beaks of the Garuda, and these birds are powerful creatures who eat Nagas for food, but restrain themselves only because of the Naga's adherence to Buddhist ideals. The implication is that by ignoring the Buddhist teachings and allowing the weather to harm others, they also expose themselves to danger and karmic retribution. Conversely, rewards are promised for generous behavior. The Mahamegasutra states that a multitude of Nagas, described in the text as a samudra or ocean, attended the Buddha as he preached a sermon predicated by a question posed by the king of the Nagas. The Naga king asked how the Nagas' troubles might subside, and in their joy they might bring forth seasonable rain to the world. The Buddha commends the question and responds by directing the Nagas to follow the law of charity, which reduces the suffering of all beings. Should the Nagas forget or fail to live up to these standards, the ritual serves as a reminder of these lessons. The Mulya Mantra Dharani Sutra, recently discussed and tentatively dated to the 6th century by Ronald M. Davidson, reveals similar characteristics. It is a complete ritual manual for rainmaking that employs a Buddhist framework to direct the regional Naga to produce rainfall. It does so with a full set of ritual instructions explicating how to construct the altar, how to make and decorate the image of the Naga, what mantras to recite, and what contingencies are available in case complications arise. I thought it might be interesting to hear the mechanical components of one of these rituals. I am here following Davidson's translation. I'm going to abbreviate it a little bit because it can be a little bit technical in its details, but I thought you might appreciate getting a sense of how complicated these rites can be. It starts by saying that if you want to pray for rain, take the manure from a blue cow and mud and make it into the image of a Naga. It should have a single body with 3 heads, vermilion on the back and gold ornamented on the thorax. Then you make a square platform. The platform then has to be painted, and in the 4 corners of the platform, you place jugs with water and braziers with incense. Then on the outside of the platform, but connected to it, you make a second circling platform called the mekhala, or the girdle, 4 cubits square, and then you smear cow dung over the 4 corners of this second layer of platforms, and on it you also place pots. One should contain water mixed with milk, one contains water mixed with curds, one contains water mixed with milk rice, one contains water mixed with fat. Then, place in the center of the platform 8 burning oil lamps, again with grain, and then you decorate that platform. At this point, an arrow is inserted in each of the 4 cardinal directions, and a 5-colored thread is then strung between them, making a perimeter for the ritual space. And then 5 colored banners are suspended from the arrows. Again, take a variety of grains, and you strew them across the platform. Then you employ ornaments that are set out as offerings. Flowers and fruit appropriate to the season are also placed around the altars. So, when this is done, the actual work of the ritual begins. And I'll read this here from Davidson's translation. This done, the ritual sorcerer faces east. Intoning mantras, he takes a full 8,000 white mustard seeds, and saying mantras, he throws the seeds one by one into the head of the Naga. That would get anybody's attention. Until he has completed the mantras and has thrown the full 8,000 times. Then a great cloud from the 4 quarters will saturate the area with sweet rain. From this time forward, the Nagas will worship the Vijaydhara, and the Vijaydhara's body and clothing are always to be pleasing and clean. And that is a summary of the qualities of the Mulya Mantra. I should stipulate, this is the short version. It gets more complicated from there. What follows is the presentation of the complete mantra and instructions on how to proceed if you encounter specific problems. These contingencies tailor the ritual to address specific threats and to facilitate specific needs. Now, as stated earlier, this is by no means the only text to contain such rituals. Promises of proper rainfall appear with great regularity throughout the Buddhist Dharani literature, and Nagas are invariably at the core of these assertions. Even those texts that are not primarily concerned with the weather often include brief passages that provide assurances of agreeable Nagas and bountiful seasonable rains. For example, the Mahamayuri Vidyarajni, which primarily protects against snake bites and a variety of other dangers, enjoins readers to recite the charm in times of drought or flood. The text promises that it will make the Nagas zealous to end the drought and to remove the floodwaters. The Mahapratisara Mahavidyarajni offers assurances assurances. Among the long list of benefits attributed to the performance of the rite, it states that the great Nagas of the region will send rain showers at the proper times, and all manner of unwelcome weather can be abated. Perhaps because the contents of these rituals seem to depart from general modern expectations about Buddhist practices, they are often overlooked. Much as the Meiji-era officials identified rainmaking practices as non-Buddhist, there has until very recently been a tendency in scholarship to dismiss these rites as marginal or exceptional. In this paper, I'd like to suggest the opposite. I hope to demonstrate that these rites are the natural culmination of a process of association between Nagas, water control, and the monastic community that began long before these rituals were first composed. To see this connection, however, it's helpful to look beyond the textual sources and consider the history of Buddhist material culture and monastery construction. For the early Buddhist community in South Asia, there were several challenges associated with choosing a location at which to build a monastery. As an ascetic institution, remote locations suitable for meditative practices and away from the noise of the city were both traditional and preferable. Yet this setting could not be overly far into the wilderness either, because the residents of the monastery were still dependent on alms offered by the urban lay population for survival. Without this dependable source of food and clothing, the monastic institutions would not have been able to function. Other concerns also had to be considered. For example, the Vinaya of the Mulasarvastavadan sect stipulates that monasteries had to be far enough from any city to be quiet and restful, but sufficiently close so that any alarm sounded by the monks would be heard and draw a response. Even the monastery's aesthetic qualities could be a factor in attracting visitors whose support was vital for sustaining the monastic community. There seems to have been, therefore, a rather narrow range that provided the appropriate levels of proximity and distance so as to meet both the spiritual and practical needs of the monastic community. Archaeological evidence from sites like Sanchi or Nalanda, seen here, suggests that in actual practice, the ideal criteria were rarely met. And the complications were magnified exponentially for those seeking to excavate a rock-cut dwelling, because they could only build where suitable mountainsides were found. These cave-like monasteries were built primarily between the 2nd century BCE and the 5th century CE, and are among the best preserved examples of early Buddhist architecture. Although rock-cut monasteries can be found across most parts of South Asia, many spectacular examples are located on the Western Ghats, a mountain range that runs along the western coast of the subcontinent, and inland among the various river valleys that carve up the Deccan Plateau. They range in size from the very modest, like here at Convite, to the very grandiose, like at Ajanta, and only some of them are associated with nearby urban centers. The rest, we assume, were supported by their proximity to well-traveled trade routes. Despite the challenges, I think I have one more here. There, this is the river system. So despite the challenges faced by communities living in these mountainous places, there were also some distinct advantages. Donations to the Buddhist order were believed to bear karmic results as long as they continued to exist and be used. Therefore, the unparalleled permanency of stone construction assured the donors a nearly perpetual karmic reward over many lifetimes. And in fact, in some inscriptions, we find this alluded to directly. Very famously in Buddhabhadra's inscription from Ajanta in Cave 26, he brags that his gift will endure as long as the sun and moon. Other benefits of these locations, one that is often overlooked, is access to water. India, like most of southern Asia, has a distinct dry season that alternates with a rainy season associated with the arrival of the monsoons. This feast or famine availability of water can have a dramatic impact on the environment and radically alters the landscape of the region over the course of a month. This, by the way, is the waterfall just if you sort of follow the caves of Ajanta around to the left. This is just to the side of that. It's leads into the river valley that forms that horseshoe arc along which the caves were built. Adding to the seasonal contrast are the waterfalls that flow in great torrents during the periods of rain. Many well-known monasteries like Ajunta, Ellora, Baja, Kondane, Kanhere, all of them are located directly adjacent to seasonal cascades. I think I have one more. No, that's okay, Kondane. Certainly the presence of waterfalls and rivers is not unexpected, given that it was erosion that created most of these cliffs in the first place. But the number of monasteries located near scenic waterfalls suggests that the builders had an intentional preference for beautiful vistas. Although being proximate to cascading water source might be dramatic, it's only useful for quenching the thirsts of monks when the rain is falling and the seasonal rivers flow. For this reason, all of the monasteries also relied on elaborately engineered systems of gutters and cisterns that ensured a year-round supply of water. Some are quite modest in scale, while others are massive subterranean spaces. Here. It's difficult to generalize about what is typical for these cisterns, however, because most have never been measured. There are several reasons for this. One of them is that the openings were often kept quite small in order to prevent evaporation. Another is that measuring these cavities today would require both climbing shoes and diving gear, and so to date, only a few of them have drawn the measuring sticks of intrepid scholars willing to immerse themselves in the murky waters. I'm looking for willing graduate students. Although these subterranean spaces may lack accessibility and ornamentation of the monastic dwellings and ritual spaces, we must keep in mind that they were nonetheless a major architectural undertaking and vital components to life in the caves. To make this point, the Buddhist site of Kanhere, I think, will serve us as a very good example. This site, composed of over 100 individual caves, is located in the hills above Mumbai, and it was built over a very long span of time, with the bulk of the construction concentrated in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. This community drew its support from the urban population on the coast, and its beautiful setting, commanding views, and carefully engineered and ornamented waterways still draw visitors today. It's a very popular date location, from what I can tell, from the young people of Mumbai. All right. The path of the flow was carefully orchestrated, at times gentle and at times pouring in cascades. Channels and gutters collected the water and directed either away from the monastery into cisterns located at the entrances of each caves. So let me show you a few views. What I'm showing you here are some of the torrents falling down, but you can see that it also sometimes can become quite gentle, forming these little ponds and sort of smaller cisterns located often near the entrances of caves. But the cisterns that seem to be the most practical and the ones that were used the most, seem to have been most relevant for those living in individual caves are the type that I'm showing you here. I'm going to skip the portion where I read this, and I'm just going to describe it to you because I think it would make more sense. What we're looking at is the entrance to the cave is over here. This is the slope of the mountainside itself. You can see it here being in during a rainstorm. The water comes down over the top into channels. This is eroded, so the water is actually pouring down here. But originally, it would have taken a right turn, moved down the side, and filled up the cisterns that are located at the entryway of each of the caves. Now, if we look to the top of the cave, this is above the entrance, we can find that there are channels that protect the entryways of the caves and channel the water away from the entrance. Now, this assuredly makes it more pleasant for those entering and exiting who can avoid having water dumped on their heads, but it also prevents erosion from the thin stone and the sculptural decoration located at the top of the cave. Now, to appreciate how damaging this water can be, all we have to do is look at the collapsed exteriors of cave sites like Pitalkhora and Baja. Both sites were badly damaged when their respective cliff faces collapsed and took the exterior portions of the monastic dwellings with them. Even the interior caves were at risk. Now, before I move on, it may not be apparent how badly damaged this was. I want to draw your attention to this sculptural ornamentation up here and this right here. Originally, this was part of the same sculptural facade of the cave. We know that this was the main entrance that leads up to the interior levels of the cave. So all of this collapsed, the front of the Chaicha as well, and the Vihara on this side. Okay. Now, even the interiors of caves were at risk from water seepage, which found its way into the caves. For instance, here at Junar, the Amba Ambika Chaicha was abandoned before its completion. And the builders made the correct choice in doing so because the water damage had weakened the interior by eroding a vein of softer stone running diagonally through the walls. You can see it right here. It's hard to make out in this particular image, but you can actually stick your hand into it. It actually is eroded deep into the surface of the cave, and you can imagine that that would have brought down the roof had they continued to carve the cave more completely. I imagine if your goal is to get good karma, having your cave collapse on the workers is really not conducive to that end. Now, similar problems afflicted Junar 18 and 19 in the Lanadri group. Any fissures or breaks in the stone were quickly exacerbated by the action of the water, and if unaddressed, could become serious problems. I think you can see exactly how it eroded. The walls themselves collapsed as water came in, eroded a layer of stone that caused the upper portions to fall. And in Kanheri 66, we can see that a similar situation was occurring with the erosion badly sort of damaging the doorways. But in this case, we see, I think, an early example of an attempt to fix the problem. We can see that there's a diagonal channel or cut in the stone, but they added a channel in the wall in an attempt to redirect the water. This may have worked for a time, but at Kanheri 66, it doesn't seem to have worked that well. However, if we go to Kanheri again and look at cave 75, I think we can see an example of an intervention that actually worked very effectively. I want to draw your attention to this little gutter, and now we're going to go inside the cave. This is where the water damage was happening. We can see it was sort of eroding the wall between the exterior wall and the doorway. And so this deep channel was cut into the wall. If you go in the rainy season now, you can see it's still wet and it still works. And the water then was pulled down this way. We're now going to go down to the gutter on the floor. I think that if you're familiar with the work of Akira Shimada, I think that's his foot. But we're going around this way. And then you can see that it leads out the front and through the front of the cave where it exits here. So in this case, we can see that water was something not just to be stored, but also something to be regulated for fear of damage. To my mind, one of the most effective interventions for preserving a site can be found at the site of Bedza. And it actually solves a question that had been sort of puzzling people. If we look at the ground plan of Bedza, you'll notice that there's this very unusual, what looks to be a monastic cell affixed to the main chaicha. Very unusual. We don't find residences affiliated with these ritual spaces. But if you look at this and go in the rainy season, and I was very fortunate that Sri Ganbir and his grad students were willing to go up in the rainy season to take the photo for me, we can see that water actually seeps in through that opening, preventing it from hitting the main cave. So this was placed there as a kind of ablative surface so that the damage could occur in some place unimportant, protecting the place that was important. And if we look again at that ground plan, you can see that there's actually a channel that directs the water out into a small cell on the porch, and then from the porch out here into the central courtyard. And so in this way, the water is taken from where it might have damaged the main hall and rendered harmless by redirecting it into a new direction. The architects and donors of these caves grappled with the regulation of water and had to plan for both times of scarcity and overabundance. As we've seen, they developed a number of complex techniques and solutions for addressing these needs. Yet for the ancient builders and residents of these mountainside dwellings, engineering feats were only part of the solution. Equally important, and typically much more visible to the casual visitor, were the efforts to find religious solutions to the problem. The regulation of water was seen as to be a concern not just for architects and craftspeople, but also for monks and ritual experts. The decoration of the early Buddhist monasteries, which often featured depictions of deities associated with water and rainfall, readily reveal this approach to problem solving. Such images are more than just decorative and are best understood as active presences with the capacity to impact monastic life. Among the most frequently encountered figures on these architectural settings are Nāgas, depicted either as shapely humans with an array of multiple cobra hoods emerging from behind their heads, or as multi-headed serpents. At Kanhari Cave 3, an image of the Nāga was placed directly above the water cistern. This association is more than just a coincidence. Julia Shaw has noted common placement of Nāgas along irrigation channels and waterways across portions of central India. Additionally, the presence of early inscriptions, both Buddhist and non-Buddhist, allow us to link Nāgas with water tanks and cisterns over a far greater distance, pointing to the widespread nature of these ideas. In fact, even the Melissa Vastavadan Vinaya says that Nāgas or images of Nāgas should be placed within the water halls of monasteries. For example, and here we're looking at very early examples affiliated particularly with the site of Mathura. 2 2nd century inscriptions from the Mathura region reveal that water tanks were donated to Nāgas and that their cult images were at times enshrined at such locations. The Ral Badar inscription records the donation of a tank and a garden for the Nāga Bhumo, who is presumably depicted on the accompanying sculpture. A second Mathura inscription, this one from Chargan, is also found on a sculpture. It states that 2 donors commissioned a tank and the image in honor of a Nāga, who is not named in the inscription, but we assume that this is the figure that's depicted here. Far south of Mathura, in what is now Karnataka state, at the Banavasi inscription records the donation of a Nāga and water tank by a princess in the 3rd century. And a tank was established at Kaladara in the Swat Valley of modern Pakistan with similar intentions. In this example, the donor states that he established a water tank for the worship of all Nāgas. In Sri Lanka, Nāgas are frequently associated with monastic water tanks, an excellent example of which can be seen at the site of Mahintale, where the tank known as, very appropriately, the Nāga Pokana, is accompanied by a 1st century inscription and a massive, albeit badly damaged sculpture of a 5-headed Nāga. I included a modern photograph and then an earlier one where I think you can see the sculpture more clearly. One might make the case that such sculptural elements are merely decorative. Yet, this claim is countered by a group of bronze objects depicting aquatic creatures, including a multi-headed Nāga, that were excavated from the bottom of a water tank in the Jetavana monastery, located in Anuradhapura in Sri Lanka. The bronzes were all placed in a sealed stone casket and were deposited at the bottom of a tank. The fact that these objects were not visible eliminates the possibility that they were simply decorative. This sealed collection of images was almost certainly part of a ritual deposit, presumably intended to assure the abundance of the tank's waters. This deposition exhibits similarities to the Sri Lankan custom of placing stone containers, typically divided into a grid of 9 or 25 cells, under religious sculptures and architecture. These containers, known as yantragalas, are often hold sacred or auspicious objects in each of their little compartments and are intended to protect and empower whatever is built above them. A second sealed ritual deposit with bronze images of aquatic creatures was located at the Kutapokana, or the twin ponds at Abhayagiri. And although no Nāga image was found among the bronzes in the deposit, there is, and there's 2 lakes, they're called the twin ponds because they're side by side. And even though no Nāga was found in the deposit, there is a very prominent Nāga image at the site, and the water that flows into the very first pool, right, the water as it enters, passes next to, or I should say under, this particular sculpture of Nāgas before it enters the pond. Both the tank and the sculpture in this case date to the 6th century. Now, one of the clearest examples of the association between Nāgas and water management at a Buddhist site is also one of the oldest. And so for this, I'm taking you back to the site of Pitalkhora. I'm not going to read, I'm going to talk you through this one because I think it'll be clearer. I want to bring you back down here. We talked about the collapsed exterior of the cave. Let's look at what was originally the entryway. Here it is. You can see 2 rather impressive guardian figures and 2 elephants. I want to draw your attention to this badly eroded image here on the side wall. This is it. If you look at it carefully, you can make out the form of a multi-headed Nāga, and you might wonder why it's so much more eroded in comparison to the other images. This is where it gets really cool. Can you see this opening here? This is a gutter system, channel that's runs up the side of the mountain. In the rainy season, water would have been collected, would have come down that gutter, and would have spouted out of the mouths of the Nāgas right into the entryway of the visitors who were visiting the site. So you can imagine that dramatic association, and one that I think helps clarify the very close association between the Nagas and the way in which water was regulated and understood at the time. All right. Now, Pitalkara is not the only monastery to have a Naga gracing its entrance. Varahadeva, the donor who built Cave 16 at Ajanta, left a lengthy inscription in which he refers to this river valley as having originally been the abode of a Naga king, its peak wreathed by masses of rain clouds. In the same inscription, while extolling the cave's features, he also notes a large cistern filled with copious water and a dwelling to the Naga king. The new dwelling referred to in the inscription is almost certainly the large Naga shrine at the base below Cave 16 on a path leading up from the river. And the Cave 16 inscription ends with a poetic plea that the donor's monastic residence remain inhabited as long as the sun shines and the peak remains crowded with multitudes of clouds resembling serpent hoods. The presence of these figures at Ajanta and similar sites highlights the association between Nagas, water regulation, and the early monastic community. Furthermore, the monastic proximity and access to Nagas both implies and reinforces the idea that they possess some ability to regulate Nagas, and by extension, rainfall. Support for this claim and further insight into this process is provided by a number of literary sources. An early example of ritualized monastic interaction with Nagas is provided by the 4th century Chinese pilgrim Fa Xian, who describes the monastery at Samkasya. He says it houses a Naga who causes the country to experience increased rain and full water tanks, all timely and without any misfortune. In gratitude for his service, the Naga was built a house in the monastery, and he was given daily blessings by the monks, some of whom were required to feed him and eat in his residence. Now, there's no doubt that the Naga is in the service of the monastery, but it's also clear that the ritualized behavior of the monks ensured his continued compliance. In short, ritualized monastic upkeep of the Naga shrine ensured favorable rainfall in the region. A later example can be seen in the textual records left by the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang. He relates the story of a lake-dwelling Naga who reforms his malicious ways after being converted to Buddhism. The Naga fears, however, that he will forget his promise to behave properly. He states, "The nature of Nagas is fierce and wicked, so that they are unable to control themselves. If by chance an angry heart arises in me, it will be from forgetfulness of our present compact." In order to prevent this, the Naga then instructs the human king to leave a bell at a lakeside monastery. The monks in residence were enjoined to strike the bell whenever they saw dark clouds forming, and this sound would serve as a reminder of the Naga of his promise to behave. Xuanzang therefore describes a Naga-centered practice intended to be undertaken by monks in times of extreme meteorological events. The 7th century landscape of Xuanzang that Xuanzang encountered was full of these reminders, left by Buddhist figures that served a variety of functions. Although not all were directly related to Nagas, some were intended to restrain their wicked tendencies or to remind visitors that Naga's acceptance of the Dharma. The lingering presence of the Buddha's shadow was left for the Naga Gopala. Traces of the Buddha's footprint called to mind the conversion of the Naga Apalala, and the ringing of a bell or the sounding of a drum were each indications of Buddhist cooperation with potentially dangerous regional gods. The persistence of legends linking Buddhism and the Nagas of the local landscape helped to organize the way in which the Chinese pilgrim understood his world. More than just ponds and rivers, these geographic features were also signposts that allowed him access to a miraculous Buddhist past. The continued existence of legendary Nagas into his own age helped to cement this continuity. For example, while visiting the renowned monastery at Nalanda, Xuanzang reports being told that the monastery was named for the Naga who resided in the nearby water tank. Although he was skeptical of this attribution, the concept seems to have been accepted locally. Likewise, when visiting Bodh Gaya, the place of the Buddha's enlightenment, Xuanzang identifies a tank serving as the monastery's reservoir, which was sacred to the Naga Muchalinda, who famously protected the Buddha from rain and high water by lifting him on his coils and sheltering him with his hoods. Similarly, at Lumbini, the place of the Buddha's birth, Xuanzang describes the presence of 2 streams, one hot, one cold, which were created by the Nagas Nanda and Upananda during the time of the Shakyamuni's first bath. The stories of the Buddha's life were widely known across the Buddhist world, but the landscape of his homeland made those events tangible. Perhaps due to the prevalence of ponds and rivers and tanks, these tales also reinforce the association between Buddhism and the Nāgas associated with these sacred places. Most of Xuanzang's stories about Buddhist interaction with Nāgas are retellings of tales found in older sources, which predate both the pilgrims' accounts and the rainmaking rituals. Stories about either conversion or piety of the Nāgas are attested to in both early texts and images. For example, the story of the conversion of the Nāga Apalala appears in many sources, including the Mulasarvastivadin Vinaya, and it has been depicted in sculpture dating to at least the 2nd century CE. The tale of the Nāga Muchalinda protecting the Buddha from a fierce storm is also well attested in early sources, and there are sculptural examples that date from the 2nd century on. The longevity of these stories, preserved and retold over the centuries, testifies to their importance. They are indicative of a wide range of tales in which Nāgas are either converted to Buddhism or require no such conversion because they immediately recognize the virtue of the Buddha and the value of his teachings. Although the majority of the Nāgas one encounters in the Buddhist literature are predisposed to respect the Buddha, it is the tales of reluctant conversion that have the most notable similarities to the rainmaking rituals developed in later centuries. Naturally, the legends of the Nāgas like Apalala or Gopala have their own unique elements, but the structure of such tales typically follows a pattern. These confrontations are often predicated by some sort of water-related problem caused by the Nāga. The crisis leads the people to seek assistance, and the situation is ultimately solved through Buddhist intervention to the benefit of all. The story of Apalala provides a good example. I'm showing you a 2nd century sculptural image from Taxila. This tale is preserved with notable differences in a number of sources, including the Divyavadana and the Mulasarvastivadin Vinaya, but I'm going to recount the version told by Xuanzang, which is the latest and in some ways the most complete. He states that in the past, a man named Gangi used charms to restrain wicked Nāgas and to prevent storms and rain. In gratitude, each family in the region would give him offerings of food. After many families failed to do so over several years, Gangi prayed that he might become a venomous Nāga and take his revenge on them through wind and rain. After his death, this indeed happened, and he became a Nāga, the Nāga named Apalala. He let flow a white stream that poisoned the fields. The Buddha, seeing the plight of the people, took pity and resolved to help them. Noticing this decision, the gods who followed the Buddha pounded on the Nāga's mountainside stronghold. This shock forces the Nāga to recognize the Buddha's strength, and after the Buddha preaches to him, he repents and seeks refuge in the Dharma. Soon after his conversion, Apalala restores the pure water to the villages and promises to only let the white stream flow once every 12 years so that he can collect grain from it. Not only does this story contrast the extortion-like practices of the non-Buddhist rainmaker with the altruistic motives of the Buddha, but it also demonstrates the Buddhist effectiveness in working with Nāgas. One more story, I think, will help demonstrate the pattern of interaction between Nāgas and Buddhists in these tales. This example is from the circa 5th century Mahavamsa, and it features a Buddhist monk rather than the Buddha as the protagonist. Even though the story is preserved in the Pali sources, it claims to relate an event set far to the north. In the narrative, a cruel king named Aravala, Nāga king, named Aravala, causes hail to pour down upon ripe crops and to wash them into the sea. A monk named Majantika went there quickly to help the people, and he got Aravala's attention by walking on the surface of the lake in which the Nāga lived. The Nāga king becomes furious and performs various terrifying acts. Great winds blow, clouds rained and thundered, lightning bolts crashed, lightning flashed, trees and peaks and mountains were hurled down, and so on. The monk, through his miraculous power, however, subdues all this terror. Demonstrating his supreme quiescence, he preaches then to the Nāga king, and Aravala becomes humbled after hearing his words, and therefore was established in the Buddhist precepts and takes refuge in the Buddha. The monk admonishes all Nāgas at this point, saying, "Henceforth, do not allow your anger to arise as before. Do not destroy crops, as living beings are desirous of happiness, develop loving kindness towards beings, thinking, may human beings live in happiness. As in the story of Apalala, the conversion of an unstable and dangerous Nāga retains aspects of his unpredictable nature, and it makes him answerable to a Buddhist system of ethics. By calming the Nāgas, the Buddhist community also calms the weather, offering stability and predictability. Although the events may be fantastic, the stories such as these reinforce the role of the monks and their Buddhist lessons as intermediaries between the public and the capricious spirits of nature. These stories have a clear message to their human listeners, but I think it's also worth considering that not every image or every story may have been intended primarily for humans. Elsewhere, I've suggested that the narrative art at Buddhist sites may have played a role in regulating the behavior of spirits. Much like the shadows and bells and footprints described in literary sources, such imagery may have offered reminders to potentially wayward spirits. Let's take the case of Ajanta as an example. Vrahadeva, the donor who left the Cave 16 inscription, refers to this canyon wall as having originally been the abode of the Nāga king. He then goes on to inform us that he personally sponsored the construction of a dwelling for the same Nāga, presumably because the monastery had either infringed on its old residence or as an act of personal devotion directed to the Nāga king itself. The new dwelling referred to in the inscription, as I stated before, is almost certainly this one here under Cave 16. And from the point of view of the donor, the Nāga was quite literally living within the monastic complex. And I think we should use this to perhaps question some of our own assumptions about the way we understand the artwork at the site. It's interesting to note that of the over 500 jatakas known through the textual materials, only a relatively small portion deal with supernatural beings. At Ajanta, however, about half of all the narratives at the site and over half of the jatakas depicted feature spirit deities of various types. It would seem that the artists and patrons at Ajanta exhibited a preference by intentionally and predominantly selecting those tales dealing with supernatural beings for representation. These jatakas' tales are quite diverse in their specifics, but most are typical for the genre and involve a moral dilemma that is resolved by the future Buddha through his wisdom, generosity, or compassion. While the details always change, it is standard for them to conclude with the spirit expressing their admiration for the Buddhist teachings. Now, of the tales that are depicted, several of them include Nāgas, including the Champeya Jataka, the Shankapala Jataka, the Vidura Pandita Jataka, the Buddhidatta Jataka, among others. Throughout the extant decoration of the 5th century caves, tales involving Nāgas and other regional deities are disproportionately represented. And this prominence is not limited only to Jataka tales. They are also widely represented in the Abhidhamma materials, as well as in tales from the lives of the Buddha, many of which feature interaction with various deities. Although these tales differ in significant ways, the narrative action in each revolves around a Nāga who seeks moral improvement through a sermon, meditation, or commitment to virtuous behavior. The Nāga protagonists are generally adherents of the Buddhist moral code and are either reminded of this moral position by the humans or conversely take the time to instruct the humans on proper behavior. Rather than being represented as objects of devotion, these tales portray Nāgas as seekers of higher spiritual states who, like humans, can benefit greatly through the Buddhist teachings. It is possible, therefore, that just as the Nāgas in the stories need reminders in order to ensure continued piety, that the Nāgas at Ajanta was intentionally and literally surrounded by narratives that reinforce the value of virtue and devotion. While these images would certainly have been comforting reminders to the public of Buddhism's success in taming local gods, I would suggest that these images were also intended for more than just a human audience. Given concern over Nāgas relapsing into bad behavior expressed in the textual accounts, it's possible that this artwork was understood to be both protective and edifying. It is well established that the monks at times had a hand in taming and maintaining local gods, and at Ajanta it would seem that the built environment may have helped in that process. The visual narratives emphasize this lesson that the Nāga realm is not conducive to enlightenment, that it's a rare treasure to be able to hear the teachings of the Buddha, and that anger only leads to suffering. Certainly these are useful lessons for anyone, but they are particularly appropriate for the local gods associated with the monastery. The inscriptions make it clear that the Nāga king resided within the bounds of the monastery, and if this was held to be true by those artists, monks, and donors who built the site, it is therefore certainly worth expanding our own notions of audience to include all the categories that may have been recognized by the builders. Simply put, in all of these cases, sculptural or ritual, the visual environment acts as a mechanism for influencing sacred beings embodied in sculptural form. And it may be that sites like Ajanta, which contain artwork that appears to have been intended for local gods, developed at roughly the same time that the formalized Buddhist rainmaking rituals were also being developed. Given this context and history, the Buddhist rainmaking rituals with which I began this paper appear far less unexpected and are certainly not a marginal or tangential development within South Asian Buddhism. The appearance of apotropaic images of Nagas at early monastic sites created an association between the monasteries and meteorology that gained momentum over time. Even in the early narrative literature, dangerous weather conditions are presented as the reason why the Buddha and his disciples intervene into the affairs of Nagas. And the continued importance of those tales is indicated by their prominence in records of pilgrims visiting in the 4th through 7th centuries. Buddhist rainmaking rituals are therefore not a novel departure from Buddhist practice, but are rather the formalization of a long-standing association between Buddhism, the spirits of water, and rain. Rainmaking texts systematized a process of conversion, regulation, and control that can be traced over the course of centuries. Thank you.